In March 2020, India came to a grinding halt. And while we were coming to terms with our new reality, India's invisible workforce that quietly drives the economy was facing a crisis. The cab driver, the newspaper guy, the house help, the factory worker. Millions of migrant workers, the people who not just build our homes but our entire lives, left without work, cash, and food. More so, left without the dignity of anyone knowing where they were and how they were, till they started walking. The visuals left us asking, why didn't we know better? We should have. But the truth is, even today, we know little about migration within our own borders. In a country where close to 30% people migrate, shifting villages, cities, and states to earn a living, not having an understanding of who goes where, when, and why impedes our ability to plan for the welfare of around 400 million migrant Indians. Omidyar Network India presents the Indian Express THINC, Decoding India's Internal Migration, a series of solution-oriented conversations with thought leaders to discuss key issues that enable us to know better and plan better, and most importantly, help us improve the economic and social conditions of our migrant workforce, the workforce that keeps us going.
Good evening, everyone, ladies, and get the best minds to give a direction and solutions. Previously, the migration series has focused on the need for research and tracking of migration data, on the responsibility of the state governments for home and destination states, on the health crisis affecting the migrant workers, on how to mainstream the concerns of migrant workers, on what can policy do to create livelihoods, and on what can be done to improve housing for migrants. Today, we shift the focus on internal migration, its impact on women and children. The session will host a keynote address followed by a panel discussion. Please join me in welcoming our guests today. Our keynote speaker is Rinana Jabwala, Chair Seva Bharat. She's also one of our panelists today, along with Anjali Borhade, Founder Director, Disha Foundation, Deepa Sinha, Assistant Professor, Ambedkar University, Rajeshwari B, Manrega Commissioner, Jharkhand. Sunalji Desai, Professor and Center Director, NCAER, National Data Innovation Center. The session will be moderated by Udit Mishra, Deputy Associate Editor, The Indian Express. I'd request you all to remain connected throughout the session on social media, as well with the hashtag Migration in India. Before we proceed further, we have a short video clip on India's migration from Omidyar Network India. Let's have a look. Thank you, everyone. Now I'll request Udit Mishra to introduce us to today's topic.
Thanks to Anshu. Hello and welcome to the 7th edition of the IE THINC Migration webinar series. When we started last year in March, the idea was to look at different aspects of India's internal migration and not just figure out what was ailing in those aspects, but also find some solutions. This is the 7th edition and we are close to ending that series. But in many ways, we are coming today to one aspect of internal migration that perhaps captures goes to the heart of the problem. If you've been following the webinar series, you might recall that there were three key words that were repeated time and again by different panelists coming from very different areas of expertise. One was the fact that India has circular migration, and that's a very key aspect because it's not as if people go from one place to another and then stay there for the rest of their life. It's a circular flow, it's seasonal flow. Often they come and go back and come back again. The other thing is the invisibility of migrant workers. The reverse flow in 2020 was a very painful way of realizing that we were absolutely ignorant about the problems of migrant workers. And so the second aspect was the invisibility of migrant workers. They just do not figure in the priorities either of the political parties or in the media dialogue or in many such drawing room conversations that we often get into. And the third aspect was related to these two, and which was that they were vulnerable, the tremendous vulnerabilities of migrant workers. Now, today's topic is the impact on women and children migrants. And why I say this goes to the heart of the problem is because the issues of invisibility and vulnerability are deepest when it comes to the women who are migrating and the children of migrants, either them migrating with the family or left behind. The data suggests that while most of the men migrate for economic reasons, women migrate, a huge percentage of them, due to marriage or family reasons. And yet they work in other states, in other places as migrant workers, and they have their specific requirements, their concerns. Children have their requirements, education, nutrition. And often these things are not even captured. The data is not there. We saw since the first episode that data was a massive gap that we had. And it just gets aggravated when you look at women and children and their needs. So today's edition is dedicated to understanding what is the status of women who migrate and children of migrant families or children who migrate, how COVID impacted them, and where are the policy solutions. So I'm sure, as many of my panelists will perhaps describe, there might be good practices, good policy solutions already in place. We must try to understand what they are, what can be replicated, and also understand what needs to be done more. I think last month it came out, a study by UNICEF and Center for Policy Research came out, and they looked at some 5-6 key states and looked at these social protections that are made available to women and children. And they found that despite the fact that many of the policies, many of the social protection policies are universal, quote unquote, they do have significant exclusions. A lot of people get left behind. Simple things like migrants not knowing what these policies are, what these benefits are, how to access them, that itself can exclude a lot of people. And then tailoring them in a manner that addresses the concerns of women and children. So let's start today's discussion. We have an excellent panel. To kick it off and set the context, we have Renana Jabala. She is the chair for Self-Employed Women's Association Bharat, and she's been involved with Seva now, I think since 1977. She received her Padma Shri in 1990, and perhaps one of the most respected voices in the country to understand what's happening, what ails women and children who are migrating. So over to you, Renana ji, and then we'll get back to the panel discussion. Thank you.
Unmuted. Thank you so much, Uday ji. And let me congratulate both Omidyar Network and Indian Express for taking up this important topic of people who are vulnerable and nobody realized that they were or that they're there. So this interest really in migrant workers or in migration really came in 2020, as you have pointed out, where we saw these visuals of groups of migrants trudging hundreds of miles, even risking death on the road to staying where they were. And obviously they made a reasoned choice, but the choices before them were terribly, terribly hard. When we looked at those visuals, there were women, although many of them were men, most of them were men, but it was assumed that the women were there just as part of the family, that the man was the worker and the woman tagged along as part of the family. Now, as far as migrants go, we do have to remember that women are the original migrants who have to migrate at a younger age due to marriage, from village to village or village to city or city back to village or town to city. And apart from the point of adjusting in a new family, they also have to adjust in a new place, work-wise, where they have no identity and no social support. However, at this stage, we will not concentrate on the marriage aspect, but let us focus on migrants, women migrants, apart from the newly married who we were talking about. And that is migration for women in 3 ways: as part of the family for employment, where the family goes for employment, or the man goes for employment, the family goes too, and the woman also works. Often migration of women alone for employment. We see that a lot among young girls, especially. You will see in many of the cities, girls from Jharkhand or Odisha or Bihar or Bengal who have come by agencies or through somebody and are doing domestic work or other types of work, working in many types of factories also. And then thirdly, something that people don't talk about much, which is the effect of male migration on women left behind. Now, we can look at both types of migration. One is the seasonal, which in rural to urban would be mainly construction. And rural to rural, which is also very high, is mainly agriculture, but also things like brick kilns. And these are seasonal. They go for a little while and then they come back. Interestingly, women also do seasonal migration. We've come across women who go from Bihar to Punjab. The whole family goes, the men stay behind. The women work 3 months in the potato season and then they go back. So the men stay for like 10 months and the women only stay for 3 months. But so one is this type of seasonal, and the other is what we are migrants who, I won't call them permanent, but they go to a new place for employment and stay there for a period of, they may stay on or they may go back. But there are new migrants who are not seasonal. So, and these new migrants really remain new migrants in all ways, in the lack of integration into the city, up to 5 years, sometimes even up to 10 years in many ways. I'd like to talk about my perspective. I'm coming from a different perspective, which is more from an action orientation. So I'm not going to talk much about statistics. We have very able and prominent people in this panel who will talk about statistics. My perspective is from SEWA, the Self-Employed Women's Association, which is an organization of women in the informal economy, rural and urban. At present, we have in 18 states, we have about 2 million women who actually last year paid a membership in spite of COVID. And many of them are migrants, either seasonal or what I'm calling new migrants. So please remember, new migrants are people who have been there for 5 years or so. Now, let's look at these issues that are affecting these women migrants. And I think, if one looks at it through the lens of COVID, then you see these issues and problems really magnified. First, of course, is the lack of work. And that's what happened during COVID. And it's not just, again, only in COVID. People go for employment they migrate for employment, men or women. And often crises, of course, COVID was a long crisis, but there are many short crises. It may be a weather crisis, it may be a election, it may be a political crisis, it could be many things, and their work and income gets affected. So this is not unusual. Now, it affects women just as much as men. Now, in urban areas, if you look at migrants in urban areas, and I'm talking about short-term migrants as well as long-term migrants, women are rarely counted. And there's a whole issue of statistics, which I'm not going to go into now. But what we have seen in our own work is that the maximum number of women in urban areas go into domestic work or home-based work. Some of them go into labor like construction. And of course, other things like street vendors, and some into factories. But domestic work and home-based workers are rarely counted. I mean, I have many studies to show that our statistics really, really undercount them, so that they, in most ways in the country, do not exist. I mean, they exist, but they don't exist to any policymakers or anywhere. So anyway, all the work stopped. Domestic workers were not allowed to go into their houses. Many of the families employed them didn't even pay them for March. And of course, would not pay them when they were not working. Construction work stopped, of course. In rural areas, some agricultural work did continue. This is what we found. So this, where was I? Yeah. So now, with the reason for them to migrate was work, and the income from this work overcame a lot of their other problems. But when work stopped, their other problems emerged. First of all, we know food. They were at the edge of starvation, many of them. And one of the reasons was, even though there was distribution of food by the government, many did not have ration cards. And their ration cards were in the rural areas. They were not transferable. And so they could not get access to the food. Later on, the governments did, some governments did do universal food. But again, a lot of that universal food was through internet registration, and many of them didn't have mobile phones. Their accounts were not linked to their phone numbers, etc. And so they were just left out. Now, this would have been overcome through income in a normal time, but during this time, it wasn't. Secondly, they have no identity. And I think that's a very important thing. They have no identity as workers or in any other way, or as citizens, which means that they do not have access to healthcare. They do not have, even when during the curfews, during the lockdowns, when other identified workers, government workers, for example, were allowed to work, cleaners, for example, government cleaners were allowed to work, corporation cleaners were allowed to work, healthcare workers, but those who had no identity, who were sweepers, contract sweepers, for example, or who worked in private homes looking after ill people, they were not allowed to work. So no identity. Thirdly, bank accounts. Now, there was government relief, but people had not opened bank accounts in the cities. They did have bank accounts in their villages, but that did not do them any good at this time. But perhaps the greatest burden was rent, because again, no income, but all of them live on rent. Nobody lives just like that, except those construction workers who live on site. We came across, just to show you the extreme, a domestic worker in Delhi with 3 girls and a boy, and the husband died during COVID. And seeing a vulnerable woman, the landlord harassed her for rent and wanted sexual intercourse with the young girl who was 15 years old. And this is not uncommon, I'm sorry to say. The other thing that showed up during this time was also how badly and how informally they are living. There's no infrastructure, and the lack of infrastructure means that their access to water, clean water, and toilets. Seasonal workers, construction workers on site, even worse, but even the new migrants live in informal colonies where this is there. And again, you know, in normal times, they would buy water. Here now that was all stopped. And given that this was a health crisis, so I'm painting a very negative picture, which I'm afraid really happened as far as the women were concerned. Education, of course, was a major issue. Even in normal times, getting enrolled in a local school is very difficult for the children because they don't have birth certificates and cannot obtain them easily. And anyway, the schools are overcrowded. And of course, for seasonal migrants, in one study we did in brickfields, we found that 85% of the children were not enrolled, had never enrolled, as opposed to 10% of the local children. And the COVID crisis, of course, made this much worse. We even have come across cases where girls were married off at young ages, like 15 or 16, because there was no chance for them to go to school because of the COVID. Lastly, you know, the women who were left behind by migrants, they are equally affected by migration. Now, in a time when the men are earning well, most men do send money home, some men don't, and so they are just left just like that. But even otherwise, during COVID, what happened was that the men stopped sending money home, and the women didn't even know where they were. And women who are left behind are either in the rural areas, are either in agriculture, or they do other income like weaving or small shops. The women in agriculture, I must say, are worse off than the men in agriculture, and I'll come to that in a bit. But the women who were like weavers, we have many weaver members who are women, but they had no income, and then the men returned, they had no income. So it was really a very difficult time. And what is happening with Manrega, I think we'll hear more from Jharkhand, but and Manrega was increased during COVID, but I'm afraid not enough, because we tried in many areas. And also, as the men came back, they were taking over the Manrega jobs so that the women were getting unemployed. What worked? I think we'll say 3 things have worked. And these are things that are provided at normal times and should be provided even more at disaster times. One is the food. The food rations during crisis gave a minimal support, since it was mostly only grain, but it did give a minimal support during the crisis and is a minimal support during normal times. So universal food. The second is cash transfers. That worked less well during the crisis because we have no proper system of cash transfers. The Jan Dhan accounts were there for women. As I said, many Jan Dhan accounts had closed down, many were in the village, and so on. But we need a much better system of cash transfers, even during normal times, and to supplement the food. And thirdly, of course, universal employment, which is the NREGA, rural employment. And again, I don't want to point out all the issues on NREGA. I think those will come out later. But NREGA during this time was some support. During normal times also is some support, and that needs to be much strengthened. So food, cash, and employment, NREGA. These are three areas which have worked. In Seva, we found a lot of work to do because bank accounts, making people open the bank accounts, getting the cash transfers, transferring money from rural to urban areas. We found that employers on the whole were fairly heartless. Domestic workers, they refused to pay. In construction sites, they refused to pay. But we were able to, in many cases, get the payments that were required. And in many of the cases where employment has stopped, there were things like masks, food, vegetable vending, etc., which we were able to do. So pivoting employment is very important at this time, and helping people to pivot employment. Finally, I'd just like to come down to what I see and think need to be done for the future. Migrants are so important for our economy, and they are so exploited. What we also see is that migrants always get paid less than local workers. And as we said, no identity, no citizenship, bad housing. So what all things are going on, what things can happen? One is the ration, one nation, one card. That's a very important policy that needs to take place. Second is, which we have been in Seva advocating, cash transfers as supportive income. There is very little social security for our workers, and even less for migrant workers, because the local social networks are not there for them. So supportive income, small supportive income of cash transfers is equally important as the food. Thirdly, education, transfer schools easily. And for migrant workers, wherever they are in local areas, they must be admitted, the children must be admitted to school. So the transfer of education. Thirdly, identity. They need some form of identity as citizens, other than the Aadhaar card, as workers. And there is this now new movement to have e-Shram cards. But it's important that this be universal to all workers. And housing, finally. Housing is infrastructure. I have a lot to say on housing. I won't go into too much detail, but there's a lot of ideas that we should provide government housing. I think that's highly impractical. You need, first of all, where it's seasonal, it is the responsibility of the employer to see that they get something decent, but it's also the responsibility of the local authorities to see that they get water and toilets. They usually do not have toilets. And equally, in the for the new migrants which are not seasonal, are not living on site, water, sanitation, wherever they're staying, water and sanitation is, we have this policy that if an area is informal, then they do not give, the local authorities do not give water and sanitation. But of course, you know, people have to go to the toilet every morning. So that health crisis, it's a health crisis, and that needs to be overcome. And finally, something that Seva has been saying, and I think some of our panelists have also been saying, women need to be recognized as workers, and schemes have to be made for them as for other workers. So as I said, home-based workers and domestic workers are practically not recognized. And, you know, I mentioned that men migrate and women take over agriculture. Actually, women have taken over agriculture almost everywhere, but they are not recognized as farmers because the land is always in the man's name. So recognize them as farmers, recognize the asset as co-owned. Even if it's not legally co-owned, maybe it should be recognized so that they then have access to loans, to seeds, to fertilizers, and to markets. So I think for migrants, recognize the migrant woman worker, whether she is part of the family or she is an individual migrant. And finally, I just want to say the individual migrants, women who migrate individually, they are young girls, and we had seen in normal times a lot of exploitation, sexual, in terms of money, in terms of any kind of support in illness, for example, and even violence. And they need real support in terms of protection where they go and awareness where they are coming from. As to what are their rights and what is the network that they can link into. So I'm just stopping here. I do realize I painted a very dark picture. And in fact, I'm sorry to say it is a very dark picture, but there's a lot that can be done. And it's really wonderful that now people are beginning to realize that migrant workers are so important for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Renana ji. That was a very comprehensive description of the whole array of problems that women migrants face and also children. Women are the original migrants. That was a fantastic line. I suppose that's something that stays with me. And I want to open up the discussion now to the panel. Some of these issues, perhaps, that Renana ji has talked about, we'll revisit them as we're talking to different panelists. Let me first invite Sonal from NCIER. Sonal has, in particular, looked at, she's a social demographer, and she's looked at inequalities across the board. I think it's fair to sort of start with you, Sonal. If you could give us a broader picture, some of the stats that Renana ji said that she didn't want to go into, but if you could give us some context setting about how bad the situation is in terms of numbers, where are we, what do we know, what we don't?
You know, statistics often tell you half truth, and it seems like migrant and challenge of migration is one area where we are constantly sort of switching contexts and using numbers in a very strange manner. So, for example, you know, you started out by talking about more than 400 million migrants, and then sort of the next sentence contained the word migrant workers. Okay, we take the number 400 million migrants, we somehow then club it with the migrant workers, and we kind of put it together. But if you start unpacking it, here are some numbers. Okay, first of all, of the 45 crore migrants that the census 2011 records, 31 crores are women. Okay, which means that 67% of our migrants are women. Now, of that, about 2/3 of the women migrated when they got married. Okay, and this is what we sort of think about as marriage migrants. And in our parlance, often marriage migration is a normal part of life. Okay, I mean, these are the people who moved, are building a new life, and we kind of don't really want to think about the challenges they face. It is the migrant workers who we continue to focus on. Okay. But I just want to remind us that, there are about 21 crore marriage migrants, so which is about half of the total migrants are the women who migrated associated with marriage. And they face some very unique challenges that I'll get into in a moment. Family migrants, people who migrate with their family or migrate to join others, are roughly about 11% of all women migrants, or about 4 crores, 1/10 of all migrants. Women who are solo work migrants, or migrate for work themselves, either they take their children, their families, whatever, but they see themselves as having migrated for work, are roughly about 3% of all women migrants, or 73 lakhs. But the biggest group for which we have virtually no statistics and very poor statistics are women whose husbands migrate for work. And that number has actually been rising over time. Now, since census doesn't give you data for it, I'm going to try and turn to some of the work that we at NCER have been doing on India Human Development Survey. And what we basically found was that in 2004-05, roughly about 3% women had husbands who had migrated, and they were sort of left in the place of origin as sort of what might we call classic left behind wives. That number had increased to 8% by 2011. Now, that's a pretty large number. Many of them are located in states like Bihar, UP, Rajasthan, where men migrate for work. They will go home twice a year and leaving the rest of the responsibilities for the family to these women. They often also take care of their children, and so the children are with them. Each of this group faces very unique challenges. Now, when we start thinking about the marriage migration, I want to remind you that much of it is in North India. North India is where the tradition exists that a girl cannot be married in her own village and she must be married out somewhere else. That has led to a sort of a cultural tradition of devaluing daughters. And not surprisingly, these are the areas in which we see very unfavorable sex ratios. Areas where your daughter will marry in your own village, perhaps within your own coterie of relations. Parents expect their daughters to take care of them in older ages, provide social support, and conversely, they are also more likely to value those daughters. This marrying out of daughters outside of the village kind of devalues often the importance of daughters to parents. We have also, feminist movement has fought very hard for land right and inheritance rights for women. But again, the daughters who have married somewhere else find it very difficult to exercise those rights and retain control to the land. So these are some of the challenges that we may see for women who are classically called marriage migrants. COVID kind of exacerbates it because in case of economic emergency, any asset they might expect to inherit from their parents, they don't have access to. Their families are far away, they don't have access to social support networks and so on. In terms of family migrants or women who migrate with their family to live and work somewhere else, statistics show that these are the women who actually have lower participation in labor force. They have a lower participation in civic activities, and they have lower sort of control over their own movement because they are in unfamiliar setting where basically they don't have any networks, they don't have any independent rights. And so these women are particularly vulnerable, as Renana Ben just mentioned. And the final group that I think we really need to pay attention to are the women whose husbands migrated and they stayed in places of origin. Some of the research I have done with some of my students and colleagues shows that these are women who have poorer health than women whose husbands have not migrated. Their children have lower nutritional status. Largely because in some ways women become solely responsible with the burden of raising and caring for children, as well as some of the managing farm and other activities. So the time crunch and the burden on these women is extremely high. And I don't think we know enough about what happened to them during the COVID when the remittances stopped coming. Again, that was some of the things that Renana had mentioned. So I think each of these groups have very different challenges, okay? And it seems to me that what we might want to think about is decoupling the word migrants from workers, okay? I think migrants face very unique challenges, and they're very important for our society and our economy. And somehow using the word migrant worker just generates this image of a factory worker and sort of hides away these other types of people who are affected by migration, particularly women. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Sonal. Fantastic. I mean, the whole idea, and I think 2020's reverse migration brought everybody's focus sharply on migrant workers, and that's why I think that has dominated whatever discussions are happening on migration. But as you pointed out quite remarkably again, 67% of migrants in India are women, and that, I think, again, from your talk, that's the big number. I think readers should understand that when we talk about migration in India, 67% are women. And so how can we not be thinking about specific targeted programs for them or have data understanding about them? Now, looking at the watch, but I want to quickly bring in, before we move to COVID specific impact, and which is where I would request Rajeshwari ji to come in. But before that, I would just want to quickly request Anjali first and then Deepa on, if you want to add just 3 minutes each, if you want to add to what the picture that Sonal has just presented in terms of what is lacking, or some other perspectives on women and children. And we haven't yet talked a bit about children, so maybe. So Anjali first, maybe. Anjali, you might have to unmute it.
Yes. So, good evening, all the panelists and all the participants, and thank you, Udit ji and Omidyar Network, for the opportunity to speak in this very important dialogue. I will just, keep my inputs very brief here, just adding to what the first two panelists have put their perspective. I think my perspective here is mostly on the migrant women and children and their access to healthcare, especially the health services related to mother and child health and the nutrition programs. So based on our research as well as the direct intervention with migrant workers, which we are doing for last almost 2 decades now at Disha Foundation, it was noticed that there are two sides, both at demand and supply side, there are gaps. So from migrant community point of view, if we talk, there is a severe lack of awareness about what kind of programs are available for them when they are migrating. And there are certain schemes, especially for mother and child health, such as ICDS programs or even the Janni Suraksha Yojana. So we found that through our research that there are very clear indications that migrants are combating with poor socioeconomic conditions, but also a lack of awareness on both antenatal care, immunization, institutional delivery, and the facilities by government, such as transport facility for the delivery at the institutions. Those were noticeable, and which we found was the main hindrance to access to the government healthcare. It was also noticed that active outreach facilities or the services by health workers are lacking at the migrants areas in cities, especially to identify and include the pregnant or lactating women and children in the mainstream programs. So there is a need to create migrant friendly outreach and access for these services like Janni Suraksha Yojana, including the mapping of urban migrants, universal outreach to all the migrants locations. So the main missing thing, as you just asked Udit ji, the challenges what we found is the migrant specific data at the city level and its integration with the mainstream health program, especially the mother and child health program, including the ICDS, and the universal implementation of MCH as well as ICDS program. And another important aspect which earlier, the keynote speaker had already addressed, is the financial inclusion of migrant women is needed on a really large scale, especially the bank account opening, and the Jan Dhan bank account opening, which is linked with various social protection programs. So I think these are the main challenges. The system is not able to include the migrant women and children, but also the migrant population is not able to getting a proper access to the beautiful programs we already have in place. Thank you.
Right. Deepak, would you want to add on, because you've been following up on many of these schemes that governments come out with, and you also track state level differences. What is the understanding there?
So I just want to make 3 or 4 points, much of which have already, much of this has been addressed by Renana ji and then with her data as well. But before getting to the scheme, I think what came out quite powerfully in both their presentations is the fact of the invisibility of the migrant woman. I think that's the first issue to address, even when we come to thinking of how schemes are designed and whether they're reaching these women. And while we talk about the invisibility of the migrant woman, to understand that this is also in the larger context of invisibility of women and children overall, not just migrant, and that they are marginalized. And when they are migrants, then they become even more vulnerable because of a number of reasons that we have heard of. But the second thing also, which came out, I thought very clearly, and I agree with, is that there is no one representative migrant woman. It's a hugely heterogeneous group. There are women who are migrating from one village to the other because they got married to the other village, or for work with family and all that we have heard. And so while we are saying that you need to especially design programs and ensure that migrant women are included, the design and the way to solve this would not probably be the same for every migrant woman. So a woman who's in a rural area versus urban, a single woman migrant would have different set of needs. A woman who's migrated with her family as a construction worker, brick kiln worker, would have a different set of needs. A long-term migrant woman would have a different set of needs. While without going into all those complicated specificities, one thing that is quite clear is that there's certain universal entitlements and rights given by the Constitution, as well as specific legislations like, say, the National Food Security Act, you have the NAREGA, you have various different kinds of, now you have the Social Security Code and so on. So one is to look at how, even though as a citizen of this country, she is entitled to this, is being left out because of the fact that she is migrant. And this, we can think of hundreds of examples of how women are left out of legal entitlements, like Anjali spoke about, from health services. Like, for instance, even something like when a woman is married out of her village, but she goes back to her natal village to deliver for 5 or 6 months, often those months which are the most important, she doesn't get the Anganwadi services because her residence is seen to be somewhere else. PDS, all of our schemes are still linked to the place of residence, and this really keeps women out, particularly Anganwadi services, PDS. So the universality of the services lose meaning if there is no portability attached to them. And portability, the only solution is not to say now we have Aadhaar so anybody can get anything everywhere. It is not working like that. There are issues with Aadhaar. There are also issues of budgetary allocations, of acceptance by governments that migrants are as much their citizens as non-migrants, and that they are therefore have as much a duty towards them. Just one more point that I want to add, that along with these services, which are universal rights and entitlements, and so we need to look at how they reach migrants, that particularly women migrants in cities have also this additional burden of unpaid work on them. They have that in rural areas as well, but in cities also because of the poor public infrastructure that is here. So absence of toilets, drinking water, safety of children. You know, you can't just leave a child and go off in a slum. The number of accidents and all kinds of other child abuse incidents that we hear of, these all put an additional burden on women and their time when they migrate with the family. So that also needs to be kept in mind. So multiple issues, it's a heterogeneous group, but looking at the fact that they have rights too, and that they are denied those rights just because they have shifted location for whatever reason, and then working out decentralized policies.
Thanks, Deepa. We'll get back to the issue of portability and universality and how the city schemes are working or not working again soon enough. The fact that there is no one representative migrant woman and how within women then we'll have to apply the same filters and figure out what kind of policies are required is a massive takeaway. Let me come to Rajeshwari ji. She is the Manrega commissioner, and as Rina ji said, that Manrega is one massive support that exists in the country. But again, as she pointed out, there were cases where when men came back, women lost that job which they had possibly through Narega. Now, Rajeshwari ji perhaps can give us a good insight into what it has been to run a scheme like Narega in a state like Jharkhand, which actually sent migrants out and then they came back in hordes. What were the challenges there? How, and especially from the context of women and children, and how did, if you could bring in some of the insights from the COVID impact, because you've dealt it firsthand. All of us sort of deal with data and academically, even reporters just reporting on it. You have dealt with it on a daily basis. So what are the insights there? What has been the experience? And there was this, if you could share the case study or the case where you had to rescue women. So if you could just share your insights, that'd be grateful. No, you're not audible. You're not audible right now. There was a background noise. If you can speak, maybe we can figure out whether we can hear you or not. No, you're not audible. Maybe we should log in and log out. Maybe, I don't know. Check. In the meantime, maybe by the time she reconnects, there could be some internet problem. Anjali ji, let me come back to you and Deepa on the issue of COVID impact. Again, briefly, what do you think happened as a result of COVID? If you could just elaborate a bit, and especially from the perspective of children also. We've talked a fair bit about women, but what has been happening to children, if there's any study, any reportage on that?
So, Uditji, we haven't done any specific study about it, but whatever intervention and direct support we have provided to migrant women and children during this hard time, I think situation has got worse, especially in first as well as the second wave. Majority of women, I mean not just migrant women, but men also lost their jobs, and as a family there was no income source available. And as already Deepa and I have made a point that the ICDS services are anyway, they are not portable, and migrant women and children do not have access to ICDS services at the destination place. So it was out of question to have, ICDS support during this hard time. They were largely dependent on the food donations by NGOs or government shelters, but that was also limited. And even, I mean, the food support was massive during the first wave, but during the second wave, it was noticed that, because of the Delta variant, everybody was so cautious, and the NGO interventions were also limited everywhere in India. So the food security was a major issue for migrant people per se, including women and children. So in that situation, we can just imagine what could be the nutrition status of migrant children. And well, there are no specific study, but we have done quite an intense literature review about migrant women and children and their situation from health point of view. And there is also kind of a reanalysis of NFHS data, NFHS 3 survey. So based on the literature review, we identified that the low status of migrant women can be seen from various indicators such as antenatal care coverage, or the prevalence of anemia, prevalence of reproductive tract infection, and even the violence against women. And especially the violence against women has increased during the COVID period. And despite the availability of government as well as private hospitals at destination, urban migrant women prefer, especially for the deliveries, they prefer home deliveries. And some of the reasons for this preference are the expensive private healthcare facilities, or the perceived unfriendly treatment at government hospitals, and especially a more emotional secure environment at home, and many times the non-availability of caretakers for other siblings in the event of hospitalization. Especially
Anjali ji, I think we have Rajeshwari ji back with us. Let's just get back on the Narega issue because we lost connection once. Yeah, let's hear it from Rajeshwari.
Yes, thank you, Udit. I hope I'm audible now. I think there was a network issue earlier.
Yeah.
So first of all, let me thank you for inviting me into this panel of such distinguished, personalities. So yes, migration has been something that I've seen not just during COVID, but I've had some experience with migration and the issues related to migration, especially women, as a collector when I was posted in Ramgarh like 4-5 years ago. And definitely I agree with the fact that there are many dimensions to migration. There are different kind of issues that are faced by different kinds of groups. Of course, women are one of the most vulnerable groups, and then the kids that join the mother and father during their migratory period are even more vulnerable. And I've seen both of them in my tenure as collector in the districts. So I will firstly give you these two case studies that I've seen in my experience. One was a family or a whole, I think it was a whole group of families that were from another district. They were working in a district called Ramgarh. And I was in just one of these very general field visits that we do once in a while. And while visiting, there was a brick kiln, and I thought I should just go and check out what's happening there. And there were a group of people standing. So when I went and I started interacting with them, and they're very obviously illiterate people, and they looked very unkempt, and unhygienic conditions was clearly visible. They were kids, they were women. And one of the women that we were talking to, she was having some kind of a health issue. And because when we go to the field, we do have some other members from the system. We had the civil surgeon on spot with me. And when he started checking the lady, he sensed that she must be having something that looked like leprosy. And she had never been to a hospital. She has not gotten herself checked. And this was of grave concern to us because we knew that she had to be immediately treated. So we decided to put a team on job to get her back to the hospital and do some checkups and start the treatment going. Unfortunately, in a matter of 2 hours, the whole community had moved on from that place. They might have gotten intimidated by our visit or whatever. And these were people from a very far off district. They were from a district called probably Garhwa or Palamu, which is like 5 or 6 hours away. And then there is no way of tracking these people because as it was mentioned, these are people who don't leave a trail. They do not have very specific ID cards. Even migrant workers sometimes even don't carry an Aadhaar card. So we lost that group. And I don't know what happened to that lady later on. But this kind of really, then we started checking the other brick kilns and we tried to get things improved for them with regard to access to toilets, drinking water. In fact, even in brick kilns, we see the living area is in itself so badly made. They're very small. Even the door frame is so short. Just to save money for these contractors, they make very makeshift kind of shelters for them, which is not at all tolerable. So at the same time, there were many kids who I am sure were out of school. They probably never got admitted, or even if they did, eventually they tend to be get into the category of dropouts because they don't get to attend schools like regular children. So this was the first case that I saw. And the another case was during during COVID, and I got to know about these two ladies who had traveled to Karnataka to work in a factory. And I got to know that in one of the lady was with I think a child. She was widowed, and she was sexually abused by the factory, some person in the factory. He was like the supervisor or something. And when we got to know and we started consulting with the police there, and we managed to get the family back. But I just cannot imagine what kind of turmoil it must have been for her to go to a new place with a hope that she'll make a living for herself and for her kid, and to end up in that situation. And of course, eventually, with the help of the civil society members, we managed to give her a compensation amount of nearly 7 lakhs from the government of Karnataka and from Jharkhand. We got the police FIRs filed, and all those things happened. But how do we then cater to the trauma that one goes through when they go through such kind of things? And this is when it, in the last panel discussion that Jharkhand state had held, when the Safe and Responsible Migration Initiative was launched by Honorable Chief Minister, I raised the same issue that for women it is really difficult to provide security and to kind of make them feel at ease whenever they are going to a far off place. But yes, this is a responsibility, and this is something we have to very keenly focus upon. And unfortunately, the person who took her to that place was somebody in the village only, some person, some far off relative, a family member. Because when we started getting into the facts and the local thana was inquiring and asking her questions, he said, no, ye to hamara chacha hi the jo leke gaye types. And that person had absconded by then. So I think awareness is very less, which is why people fall into such traps. And the middlemen are quite active in this. So it's not just very specifically to that one person who is migrating, but there are many other stakeholders in that village who are active. I think we need to have an understanding of how they work and how we can ensure that these kind of people do not get an opportunity to dupe others and just take advantage of these vulnerable communities. Now coming to the COVID situation, during COVID, we did have institutional detention centers for people who were stuck during lockdown, and Dumka district, being a neighboring district of West Bengal, and also a transit route between West Bengal and Bihar. We had a huge number of people passing through Dumka. And one thing that data showed us was most of these people who we housed in the detention centers, I think they were 95% men. Because it's very easy for men to get out of a place if they're alone. They can just get into some bus, they can get into some truck, they can hitchhike from some through some place. But when you have a family, when you have a wife, you have children, mobility becomes a little difficult, because there will be some money that needs to be spent, and maybe not everybody could make those kind of arrangements, which is why we saw many people were walking, and they were making all these kind of attempts to reach their destinations. But we housed thousands of men who were single, and it was very easy for them to try to get back to their homes. Unfortunately, they got stuck during the transit. But yeah, it was we used to provide them lunch and dinner, and though quarantine was difficult, but they didn't at least have to face all these issues of having to walk back and stuff like that, because we provided vehicles and we made all the arrangements for them to go back to their homes. And I think, yes, during migration, we also saw that most of the women that got back, they were also young girls, unmarried. They're just gotten out of maybe 12th standard, or the most of the population in Jharkhand manages to do until 12th, which we say inter. But after that, higher education, because it's not very accessible to people, then these girls start looking for opportunities of a livelihood. And there was a group of girls who had gone to Himachal Pradesh to work in a helmet factory. And once the lockdown was in place, the factory shut down. And as Madam mentioned, Renana ji mentioned, that the contractors, the people who hired them, totally gave up on them. And they didn't want to house them even for a couple of days, a couple of weeks, because it would obviously mean that they would have to spend some money on them. So we took it upon us. The system catered in part by sending vehicles and getting people back. We sent vehicles to Chhattisgarh, to Andhra, and far off places, to Nepal. We had groups coming in from Bhutan. But yes, then it is a challenge for the government, because for a state like Jharkhand, where the employment is an issue, and there is disguised employment, and there is unemployment. There are people who want to do good jobs, but they're not able to get into these organized sectors. So then when these girls come back, and we were wondering, now what do we do with this? They are skilled, they've worked in a factory, now where do we place them? There was also another group of young girls who had come back from Tamil Nadu, and they were working in some textile factory. And apparently there was this person who arranged a ride for them. They were taken in buses, they were given training in textile, in stitching or whatever, tailoring. And just as they started to work, the lockdown came in place, which is why they had to come back. So then it becomes the government's job, it becomes the government's business to try to provide employment for all these people. Otherwise, they will have to go back. They don't have many options there. Now coming to Manrega, MGNREGA has definitely taken a rise after COVID. And the government quite actively promoted Manrega for people who had come back. And in Jharkhand's context, there was a historical rise in percentage generation in Manrega in 2021. And this year also we are close to reaching almost like 9 crores person days of employment. And while we talk about Manrega, we also are looking at the data of what is the participation of women of vulnerable sections like the scheduled castes and the scheduled tribes. And there has been a decline, not just in women, but also in the other vulnerable sections of SCs and STs. And I've been looking at Manregas in the last 6 months. And once it came to our notice that there is a regular decline every year, there is a 1.5% decline. We then started to identify which are these areas and what is the reason for the decline. And this year we have managed to increase women participation by a bit, and also the participation of SC/STs by like 2%. If we had not maybe proactively pursued this agenda, maybe there would be a decline, but we seem to have arrested that. So when we talk about Manrega, what we have to accept is it's an unskilled labor.
Ma'am, also explain what was the reason you found that it was declining for women? Was it the same thing that Renana ji mentioned, that men are taking in jobs in the same household?
See, in Manrega, we provide 100 days of work for the household. We do not, it doesn't matter to us whether it is the man who has worked or the woman who has worked, but it is 100 days per household. Definitely, I think that's what I was coming to. When we speak about Manrega, it is unskilled labor where most of the job is related to digging pits and soil conservation works, and something that maybe women are not very comfortable with at this point of time. So what we try to do is, or rather Government of India also is promoting, is that we give certain kind of jobs for focusing on women. For example, now this last year onwards, we have this concept of Bhagbani Mitra. Jharkhand is promoting a Yojana, Birsa Harit Gram Yojana, where we are giving fruit orchards to farmers who are having land. So for the maintenance of these orchards, we are placing a Bhagbani Mitra, and it's a 5-year project. So we know that for 5 long years, if one is selected as a Bhagbani Mitra, she will be secure for those 5 years and she'll earn some livelihood. So now we are focusing on these kind of jobs which may attract women more. Traditionally, we see that women work mostly in agriculture works. There is seasonal migration, as Madam said, during the potato season, they go to West Bengal, the neighboring districts of West Bengal, and they do that. They do the paddy plantation, the dhan katai jo hota hai usme. But I'm not sure if women are very willing to do the hardcore job that is the core of Manrega, where you actually have to take the spade, you have to dig with an axe. So maybe that is one reason why women are not very attracted to Manrega, and this is something that we have started to look into, and we are trying to provide for schemes that will attract women. We are also trying to give, for example, this year, one of the reasons why the decline has been arrested, the women participation that was declined has been, we have been able to control to an extent, is by giving Didi Wadis. This is another scheme that was started by the government last year, where rural households usually have a small parcel of land nearby the house, where we are giving them a kitchen garden. This can be given to any woman. This is given, the beneficiary has to be a lady of the house. And the concept behind this was, while you're giving them an employment, a livelihood opportunity, you're also catering to the nutritional needs of the family, especially if there are pregnant women, there are adolescent girls, there are children. We know that Jharkhand has a malnutrition issue. So this very interesting collaboration of outcomes was envisaged in Didi Wadi Yojana, and which is why, of course, implementation is another issue. Implementation has been challenging because it takes time to identify beneficiaries. It takes time to get their projects sanctioned and to get it actually implemented on field. But still, I think we have quite a lot of women who then got interested in this project, and they started asking for jobs in Manrega. So maybe it is the kind of schemes of Manrega that has not been very favorable to women till now. But we hope that with initiatives such as Didi Wadi, Birsa Harit Bagbani Mitra, there is also Didi Bagya scheme, which is the scheme where we are promoting the JSLPS SHG groups, the self-help women groups, to go for nurseries, because in Birsa Haritgram in our state, every year there is a plantation about 40 to 50 lakh plants. So now we are trying to see if these plants can be provided by these groups. And we are giving them the funds also to set up a nursery. It's being done in collaboration with the State Livelihood Mission, Jharkhand State Livelihood Promotion Mission, Society. So maybe these are the kind of schemes that will attract women to Narega. So it is not that men are trying to take over, or it's not that we had there's not a great difference between the men and women. Of course, there has to be more research specifically in this aspect. But in the last 6 months, what I have perceived was that Narega is also mostly seen as, this very hardcore mitti kaatne wala job, which women generally tend not to get involved with. But we are also trying to provide for women who are active. There needs to be a shaded area. There needs to be facilities at the site. Of course, how well that is implemented is another ball game. But yeah, the provisions are there. If there is a lactating mother, or if there are kids on site, then there has to be an area where she can feed. There needs to be a creche, and all these things are made. They are built in the act in Narega. Narega, I think, has been trying to cater to this issue of migration, but then again, it's a choice that people want to make. Narega, after all, gives you only 100 days of work and 150 days if you're a beneficiary of the Forest Right Act. A Forest Right Act benefactor can take 50 days extra. That is 150 days. So what will they do the other days, the rest of the days? So it's a choice people make for better quality of life, and it's very difficult to restrict people, and that is probably why the system has been unable to address this issue of migration for so long, because it's difficult to track who is going where. And for example, we also got to see the migration that happens for the BRO, the Border Road Organization works that happen in Himachal and Leh Ladakh and all these areas. I learned, though I have been in the cadre for the last 10 years, I didn't know that nearly every year, 5,000 to 6,000 people from Jharkhand go to work at these high altitude regions to build for the Border Road Organization, the roads and the infra that BRO is building. This is silently happening from last so many years. And interestingly, why even BRO kind of favors Jharkhand for this work is because they find that the men here, or the population here, is more able to do such kind of works. In fact, in the conclave that was held in December on Safe and Responsible Migration Initiative, when the state team had visited Leh Ladakh and they interacted with the BRO representatives, the BRO representatives said that they're very sincere. The work that the groups coming in from Jharkhand were very sincere, which is why we prioritize that we need workers from these areas. And it's been happening for so long, and
I think
not many are aware.
Yeah.
So
the point you mentioned about jobs, like you mentioned Bagbani Mitra, and jobs specifically tailored for what women can do as against what men can do within the same maybe budget allocation is a remarkable thing. And I want to just get back to that. I want to circle back on the issue of solutions. I mean, one of the key points about having this webinar is to also look at where the solutions may lie. And I want to just circle back with starting with Deepa maybe. In what do you think, because we have a certain time constraint. So just want to understand what are the possible solutions that India should be looking at, either center level, state level. Often it gets sort of enmeshed into all this debate about center state. But from your understanding, what are the 2-3 things that we should be looking at, either policy solutions or outside policy, civil society, where do the solutions lie and what they might be?
Yeah, I think it's difficult to give easy, quick solutions, but just taking on also from some things that Renanaji mentioned in her opening remarks, especially in the context of COVID, we're seeing that food security continues to be one big challenge, particularly for migrant families, because the PDS, while it has been one of the most effective responses to COVID, the additional 5 kilos of free grain, and we are doing multiple across the country where we are doing surveys. We find that families which got this food tell us that it was really that kept them away from starvation often. Although it's limited, it's only grains and there is no dal and oil and so on after the first 6 months in 2020. But a lot of migrants are left out of this because even if they have ration cards, they don't have it at the destination location. And many are actually do not have ration cards, particularly migrants in urban areas, because in urban areas, even long-term migrants often don't have the documents which are required to be able to get a ration card. Like in Delhi, you have to give an electricity bill, you have to show proof of residence, and most people live on rent, and the owners of the houses are usually not willing to give this in writing that they live there on rent and what their electricity bill is and so on. So the first would be making the PDS universal, at least in this immediate 1-2 year period where there is this COVID impact that households continue to face. Now again the third wave, and again people are losing jobs and are looking for food support. So that I would say I would put it on the top of my list because it's also been one of the most effective responses. So we know it works. We have food grain stocks, ensuring that migrants get it by making it universal. Of course, there is now the ONOR, which makes the technically on paper it is portable, but it's taking off very slowly, and there are a number of exclusion issues which we don't have time to go into right now. But ONOR during COVID crisis time, a new scheme cannot be the solution. There are a lot of teething issues, and there are issues with Aadhaar. So it is a longer kind of agenda for portability, but I don't think that's the immediate solution. The second is, like we said, PDS is only giving grain still. And we have seen that people keep losing jobs, getting jobs back. Women who have lost jobs, fewer of them have got it back. At the same time, in a city like Delhi, many more women who are coming out to work now, particularly as domestic workers, because the men are not finding any work. Construction work is not opening. A lot of other daily wage work is not being available. So even though at lower wages, they're coming out to work, but the cash flow in the house is very low. And therefore, again, I agree that especially again as COVID response, just a 500 rupees 3 months is not sufficient, or one time 5,000 rupees to construction workers or particular sectors is not sufficient. Actually, a regular monthly kind of a cash transfer is something that needs to be thought about. And a big problem in cash transfers also, one is of course the bank account issue. The other is not having list who will you give it to. How do you target this cash transfer? I think we should think about now the e-Shram registration that is happening, for instance, where unorganized sector workers are being registered, the street vendors have been registered, construction workers have been registered, to consolidate all these lists and start with the women in all these lists and to have some sort of a cash transfer. Thirdly, what I was saying in my earlier remarks also, that to take all universal entitlements and make them as document free as possible. So a child who is less than 6 years old, for instance, is entitled to supplementary nutrition from Anganwadi. Other than showing that there is a child, they should not require any other evidence. You know, if there is a young child, that child is entitled to this. They should not be asking for Aadhaar, proof of residence, for how long has the family lived there and so on, and do some sort of a mapping and make these schemes on demand. So if families are coming forward for supplementary nutrition, to admit their children in school, which also gives them access to midday meals, these are the things that need to be done and can be done very easily. No, we already have the systems for all of this. It's just a question of including people here. And particularly in urban areas, particularly in big cities, also community kitchens or some form of cooked food, at least during these periods of curfews and lockdown where people don't get work. Because like Anjali was saying, in the first lockdown, we saw a lot of that. But consequently, each time there is this crisis, there are fewer and fewer of these kind of centers that are being opened up by the government. Again, I mainly speak from my experience in Delhi during this period. Second wave, we had fewer schools giving food. This round, it's not really taken off at all yet. One last thing also, Delhi did do a good experiment on the PDS question of opening it up to those who didn't have ration cards. But again, that was the problem, that the first round, when they started, you had to register online. And it was not so easy. It was not just a question of having internet access, but you had to scan passport photographs and scan your Aadhaar cards and put them all up online during this time of national lockdown. It was at that time. So making that simple, which they did in later rounds where people could just go and queue up. But at the same time, because there are no numbers and somewhere there are governments don't want to spend too much money, the allocations are very small. So even though Delhi said whoever comes to a school without a ration card and asks for ration, we'll give it to them, they had an unwritten rule of in a day we will do 20 lakh people. And the queues were much, much longer. So again, having enough. Now through the experience of the last 2 years, we kind of have an idea of the demand and the numbers. 70 lakh people in Delhi, for instance, finally took these temporary rations. So why do we again start with 20 lakh the next time round? We should start with 70 lakh. We know at least so many are there. So planning for the larger number and universal.
Right. I want to, before we open up, because there's some questions now lining up and we are running short of time, and I want to end with Sonal on the same question on what the solutions might be. But Renana ji wanted to make a point on labor laws. Could you quickly make that, ma'am? And then we'll go to Sonal for the final comments on.
Yes, it's a very short point, which is that I'm especially now talking about migrants who work for employers and contractors. And we unfortunately now no longer have any. Interstate Migrant Act has been repealed and the Contract Labor Act is not implemented much. So we don't have any laws which give some responsibility to the employer, especially for migrants. And for women, I especially want to say that there is a Sexual Harassment at Workplace Act, and it does include informal workers. But those systems for informal workers have not been set up, and they can be set up also with the help of civil society, especially in places where women work at the work site. So brick kilns, construction workers, and especially seasonal migrants who don't have their own living space. There is extreme amount of sexual exploitation. So I just wanted to point to that, where it exists, at least let's implement it.
Right. Anjali, you wanted to make a point. Could you just keep it very, very brief? We're just running out of time.
Sure, thank you. So regarding the solutions, I want to make 2-3 points. First and most important is how the ICDS services can be made universal. And there is a successful pilot of Maharashtra ICDS department for tracking and inclusion of migrant women and children within 3 districts of Maharashtra. So the learnings of these pilots can be replicated widely. Second point is Ministry of Tribal Affairs has taken very proactive step by setting up National Tribal Migration Data Portal called Shram Sathi to capture the data of outgoing migrants from villages, and also how the registered workers or the tribals can be provided benefits to different programs under the Atmanirbhar Bharat. They have also developed Shram Sathi training manual for the empowerment and awareness of migrants to avail their rights and entitlements. So this migrant-centric initiative, which needs to be owned by other states, Ministry is trying very hard towards it, and I think it's a ready material states can use easily. And I want to make a very brief point to Rajeshwari ji that we also tried with Jharkhand state, especially for your outgoing migrants, for the dissemination of this training manual. Maybe we can connect separately about that. My next point is there is upcoming migration policy by Niti Aayog, which is a promising step to bring all the government stakeholders together to address the migrants issues, and I hope The policy will also address the portability issues of various schemes for migrants. And the last and very important is the role of NGOs. We have seen the massive contribution of NGOs during COVID times, but that was limited towards a very emergency or temporary support in terms of travel and food. But these NGOs needs to come forward to provide sustainable support by including migrants into their ongoing programs, and for that capacity building of NGOs very important. I want to make a point here that in collaboration with World Health Organization, we have developed a very comprehensive manual for NGOs which can provide them hand-holding assistance, right from how to conduct research with migrants and how to design and implement various interventions for migrants, right from health, livelihood, legal support, social security, etc. So we will be conducting multiple webinars in collaboration with Niti Aayog to disseminate this material with NGOs across India. So that's all I want to make. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Sonal, all yours. 2-3 minutes. If you could give us some understanding of what you think where the solutions lie.
Very briefly, I think what we need to do is de-link as many things with residence proof as possible. Okay, children should not need residence proof to be able to go to school. Women should not need residence proof to avail of any kind of maternal and child health services. So just go through everything where we currently require residence proof and think rationally, do we really need it? Okay. And as far as possible, where we don't really need it, a child can go to school anywhere. What does it matter whether, he goes into one town or another town? Okay. So if we can de-link a residence proof with most things, that would be a very helpful thing to do. The second thing is, I think that we must recognize women migrants who are marriage migrants, because their property rights in their natal families, okay, are often very difficult to exercise because of the fact that they don't live in the same location. So land registration and ensuring that those registrations contain women's name and an easier access to sort of figuring out monetizing that land, okay, would be a very sensible thing for us to think about. I've learned that.
Right. Let's take up a few questions. We have some questions lined up. I would request whoever is asking the question to please tell us who they are and who they are asking this question to.
Please go ahead, Mr. Sonowal.
Yeah, much Professor Sonowal. Right now I am attached with the International Institute for Population Sciences in Mumbai. I am just involved in a very small kind of field survey of women domestic workers in Navi Mumbai. Here I found that if it is possible to just make some kind of arrangement for, say, livelihood diversification among the women domestic workers, especially in the city areas, through some kind of providing training, because mostly they are actually unskilled workers. They know only doing some kind of household work only. So according to their version, actually, when I just interviewed them, then they told that because they did not have any other skill during this lockdown period to just survive. So they could have been this could have been good practice, I think. So if there is any kind of government agencies or say NGOs, they're talking about Seva, Madam is there. So just I wanted to know whether we have that kind of arrangement for training for the women domestic workers working in city areas, or anything coming up in near future. Thank you. Yeah, that's my
Right.
question.
If I understand correctly, you want to know whether there is any training facility for domestic workers.
Yes, yes, yes.
Right. Renanaji, would you want to take that question?
Yeah, sure. The first of all, I should say that a lot of women are getting out of other work and going into domestic work. For example, construction work, there used to be a lot of women. They've been more or less pushed out, and they are going into domestic work. So domestic work and middle class people are hiring more and more. So domestic work is opening up as an opportunity. Taking them away from that into something else may be a little difficult because there is no other major opportunity now in the urban areas. However, there are three things that can be done for them. One is a skill upgradation, which means that they just do jhadu pocha, but cooking, childcare, old age care, those kind of domestic needs pay more and are more skilled. And there are such training programs. I think NSDC has them, but apart from NSDC also, many of the organizations are doing it, but much more needs to be done. Secondly, there needs to be a recognition of domestic workers as workers, and as we have policies for construction workers, we need some social security policies for domestic workers. And the third thing is, I had pointed to employers, but employers are all of us, middle class people. So some education of employers of how you can treat, of what kind of payment should be made, because we try to have a race to the bottom, even though we can afford it. Even when we can afford it. So, employers can take more responsibility also. Those are my 3 points.
Right. I think our next question is from Mr. Ajay Kakkar. Can you be very precise exactly what you want to ask and who you want to ask it?
Hello. First of all, thank you very much for giving me the opportunities for attending this webinar. And am I audible? Yeah. So very first thing that that after all said and done, apart from COVID and non-COVID period, the basic issue of migration is on roti, kapda, makan, and education, medical, etc. So whether it is COVID period or non-COVID period, the people will still migrate because of these reasons. So then we have these facilities in their own area. And I've been seeing from my childhood that in our country, there are different levels, taluka, district, state, central. So if we have all these facilities in these local areas and monitored, and also accountability, unless until we have accountability, there cannot be any improvement. There cannot be much improvement. Secondly, why don't we take help of the technology like computerization? Suppose if in taluka, the taluka office, if you have a computer and all the records are kept there, same way the district will monitor the talukas and the state will monitor all the step by step, all the line down the line, and then the people will be worried to run this organization in a better way. That is the first thing. And secondly,
if I understand your question correctly, you want to know why can't we make it easier at the taluka or a block level or a district level? Rajeshwari, would you want to take that question?
So my question is still remaining. The thing is that we also need to educate the people there, because still in rural areas, the people have the mindset that not to give education to the girls. Secondly, the girls should be married at an earlier age. So unless until we break this mental block, then only our situation will improve. And apart from that, to generate the employment, there are number of NGOs which are coming out with the different technology. Like plastic is becoming a very problem. So they are developing products from the plastic which is being sold in the market, and that way they make their livelihood available to the local people.
Kakar, what is the exact question? Do not make a comment. Please ask this specific question that you want to ask.
Yeah.
Technology can be not used at the taluka block level. Let's
Right.
hear to that. Let's let Rajesh answer that.
Yes, I think definitely technology is something that we all accept is a very desirous tool in the hands of administration and management in these days. But unfortunately, they are not very well developed to be that we be able to track each and every individual. And with technology also comes newer set of challenges. It's not a foolproof system ultimately. When Aadhaar came, what we all thought was it is going to be the end of all corruption, and the DBT process will ensure that each and every rupee will go to the right person, etc., etc. But so many years after Aadhaar, we still do deal with fraudulent transactions and financial misappropriation. And Narega is being one of the massive employment schemes. Imagine having a workforce of around 40 lakh job card holders in your state, with at least 25 lakh of them actively participating in Narega every year. I mean, yes, we do lay down SOPs. We set protocols that, Aadhaar verification, account seeding, and all these things has to be done. But there is no foolproof system. And hopefully in future, such a system might evolve. But right now, yes, we are using technology. We are able to address a lot of issues that were there, say, 4 years ago, 5 years ago. But at the same time, there are newer issues that we are facing. And this is something that we will have to keep facing. And with regard to, the roti kapda makan wala issue, I think that is the challenge. And these newer discussions about how there needs to be mobility of these services, that a person can take his ration from anywhere in the country. A child should be educated anywhere in the country. I think they sound great in theory, but until and unless we implement them, we set the rules, we set it in place, and we start implementing them, we don't know what other kind of challenges will come. So of course, an attempt has to be made to try to rectify these things, but there's no way of knowing how far successful we will be. But I'm happy that the discussions have begun, and technology definitely is something that we all know and are aware is a huge advantage to us. But at the same time, if we speak specifically in Jharkhand context, we have hardly 30% of people who have access to internet on their smartphones. Maybe we've given them BharatNet till the Panchayat Bhavan. We are able to give their birth certificates. We are able to give their caste certificate, everything through the e-services. But how many people can actually hold a smartphone in their hands and have access to the digital class that the government system is giving them? How many children can afford that? How many in urban houses, that there are more number of mobile sets than the number of members in the family. Each one carries 2 or 3 phones. But that's not how it is in the rural areas. There's one phone, and many a times not even a smartphone. For example, in Narega, there is a monitoring system in place where you have to daily monitor the muster roll attendance of laborers. And when the implementation is so weak in Jharkhand, and we in our reviews, we ask our teams in the field, bhai, kya problem hai? Why is this not happening? And we get to know that there's a huge number of females who don't have a smartphone. Forget an app. So either they will have to borrow it from that one person who has it in the phone, who has it in the house. Yeah, if there is a phone, you're really working in such remote areas. It's a hugely covered scheme. Not necessarily everywhere there should be very good network where you can upload photos and you can upload attendance, and it takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of effort, but we are doing it. We are getting there, and hopefully things will fall into place as time goes.
Right. Let's take the next question, because this technology one, we've known that technology has its until it's implemented. Let's take the next one. Shohini Majumdar, I think from IIM Calcutta. Please tell who you're asking this question to.
Yes, thank you so much for this opportunity. I'm doing a PhD in migration from IIM Calcutta. So my question is for any panelist who wishes to offer any insight. So when we look at the census data, migrants whose reason for migration is listed as business instead of marriage or work, they are a very minuscule proportion. So do you have any insight on women migrants' choice of livelihood, like whether they sought themselves into low-skilled wage employment or whether they sought themselves into low-skilled self-employment, such as business and low-skilled enterprise and family enterprises? So like in both areas, in both wage employment as well as self-employment, migrants and especially women, they face a lot of discrimination. So do you have any insight as to which of these two modes of livelihood women migrants usually find themselves being sorted into in terms of the disadvantages that they face in each area?
Thanks. Sonal, would you want to take that question?
Yes, I think that the census data asks you the reason why you migrated. They do not ask you what as a migrant now you're doing. Okay, and the two linkages are very difficult to make. So if we think in terms of what women who have migrated, not for whether they migrated for work, for marriage, for whatever reason they migrated, once they migrated, what are they doing? And I think that that's where sort of the crux comes in. The other issue is, of course, that the self-employment and work in India are so closely linked. We have, 80% of our population is in informal sector. Okay, and once they are in the informal sector, many of them are both sort of doing small businesses for themselves as well as doing wage work on the side. So I guess my answer is that I don't have a good number for you to give you because statistics simply don't exist. But the number of women workers among migrants is much higher than the reason of migration suggests.
Thanks. Thanks. Next question is from Abha. Abha Mishra from UNDP. Could you also specify who you're asking this question to?
I'm Abha Mishra. I'm working as the head of UNDP ORESA team. My question is open because it can be answered by any of the panelists, which have been very wonderful. I mean, it's a very good discourse. You did mention about health services and it's limiting it to a little bit of women needs, immediate needs. But when a woman or a girl child is migrating, there are many problems which they come across, including due to harassment. So what type of solution would you suggest should be looked into besides the approach to the normal health services which is available at the source of destination? Is there something which you would suggest the civil society or the destination, the source governments could suggest to be provided at destination sites?
Anjali, would you want to take that one? Very briefly, 2 minutes answer.
Sure. So thanks, Abha, for raising a very important question. I think to be brief, I mean, as a brief answer to your question, there need to be a coordination between source as well as the destination health system. And if you are talking, I mean, that could be very specific to a particular health program or health service. It could be ICDS or other MCH programs, but there needs to be a constant data sharing and a coordination between the source and destination. And I think we have a very successful example of universal polio immunization, right? So we have that program to refer, and I think the same model needs to be replicated for other programs as well.
Right. Last question. This is Deepthi. Please specify who you are asking this question to.
She's not with us in the room. We can move forward.
Okay. Okay, we can move forward. Okay, so I'll invite Shilpa from Omidyar Network to give her concluding remarks. Over to you, Shilpa.
Thanks, Udit, and would like to begin by thanking Udit and Indian Express for really spotlighting the issue of women and children within this whole migration conversation that we've been having. I think Renana Ben kind of kicked it off with talking about the double invisibility that a woman migrant seems to be facing. And I think that double invisibility, what the panelists said, was also compounded by maybe the double layer of vulnerability. Indeed, it seems like the woman migrant worker has lesser access to relief, lesser access to livelihoods, and in fact, the increased possibility of violence, both physical and sexual. I think Dr. Desai made a really important point about the proportion of women migrants. It's large. The fact that that number is not only large, but also the proportion is growing. Indeed, quite rapidly growing. Even if you look at what she called the left behind women. And I think both these really pointed, to the fact that in the end, it boils down to need for identity and need to be counted. I love the way that Deepa put it, that there's no one single migrant profile. They are very, very heterogeneous, many different kind of migrant women profiles. And in a sense, program design needs to maybe take that into account, take this diversity into account. I think a lot of the panelists touched upon the fact that during COVID, some things worked better than others. Food worked better than others, and that's what even data that we have shows. Cash transfers worked, but maybe a little bit less, compounded by some of the issues that affect them. And Narega also was affected by some specific issues. And I think the point that got made is that while some schemes are universal in design and should be accessible to everyone, regardless of where they are, the fact of the matter is they are affected by the federal structure and location-based design. I think Dr. Anjali made some great points about how improving access therefore remains the key. The trinity of identity, bank accounts, mobile access, indeed seems like something to still keep our focus on. But again, I think, and many panelists pointed to the fact that some schemes, can they just go beyond identity, especially when they are to do with the most vulnerable parts of the population, for example, young children. And then when we talked about solution, beyond, of course, improving access, what's the role of various other stakeholders? What's the role of the source and destination state? And can there be sharing of ideas that have worked? For example, Delhi's PDS, distribution that went beyond identity, or what Dr. Anjali pointed out was ICDS implementation in certain districts in Maharashtra, and how can we learn from some of these experiences. Renana Ben also, of course, touched upon the whole role of law and implementation of the law, and indeed within that, the role of the employer. So I think that's lots of things to think about and to take to action. But for me, in the end, it boiled down to the question of identity. So if double invisibility has to be moved aside. It boils down to identifying and counting, and not only in urban areas, but also in rural areas. And therefore, what's the role of the new initiative, eShram cards? Can that really help in terms of identity and counting? And lastly, and I thought very important, that even where women, the women who actually are left behind and work as farmers, how is identity even for them possible? And how can that really be enhanced by making them co-owners of the land that they work? I think it was a really rich discussion, and I'd like to thank everyone on the panel, Indian Express and Udit. Thank you, and back to you.
Thank you, Shilpa. Just wanted to say thanks to all the panelists, and I'll throw it back to Suanshu. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Udit. Thank you, panelists. We'd like to thank our presenting partner, Omidyar Network India, for helping us put these series together. We'd also like to thank our webcast partner, 24 Frames Digital. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We will be in touch as we announce the next event, focusing on some specific aspect of migration in a bid to get a deeper understanding of the challenges and find more direction ahead. Thank you so much.